What would you do if a stranger hid under your skirt and you didn't even know who he was? Cassidy Moore came to Seoul for 30 days. She had a contract to close, a return flight already booked, and absolutely zero interest in any kind of distraction. She had a plan. She always had a plan. Then a man she'd never seen before dove under the fabric of her skirt in the middle of a crowded market. And everything she thought she knew about herself got rearranged. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face. She didn't know that half of Asia had that face memorized. What she knew was that he was ridiculous, presumptuous, infuriating, and somehow, inexplicably, the funniest person she'd met in years. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that 30 days is exactly long enough to rearrange a person. To take everything she thought she knew about herself and quietly, irrevocably, put it back in a different order. This is the story of Cassidy and Rejun. Two people who had no business finding each other in a city that wasn't hers, during a season that was never supposed to matter. It mattered. If you're new here, subscribe and drop a comment. Would you have let him hide, or would you have screamed? I need to know what kind of person you are. Seoul in late October had its own particular energy. The air had that edge to it. Not quite cold, but cool enough that you noticed it when it moved through your clothes. The streets of Gwangjang Market smelled like sesame oil and frying batter and something sweet underneath everything. And Cassidy Moore was sitting on a low wooden bench near one of the tteokbokki stalls with a paper cup in one hand and her phone in the other, doing 3 things at once the way she always did. She was reading an email from her client back in New York. She was eating, and she was telling herself, for the 4th time that week, that she did not need to be charmed by this city. Cassidy was 28 years old, a consultant for a mid-size American entertainment firm called Vantage Creative, and she had been in Seoul for exactly 6 days. Her job was to negotiate a licensing and creative partnership between Vantage and a major Korean entertainment agency called Shinhwa Entertainment. The deal was worth a significant amount of money to both sides. It was also the kind of deal that, if she closed it cleanly, would move her from senior associate to partner faster than anything else on her trajectory could. She had 30 days, 24 left. She was not supposed to be wandering through markets eating street food on a Tuesday afternoon, but her afternoon meeting had canceled, and her hotel room had started to feel like a holding cell, and the woman at the front desk had said Gwangjang with a smile that made it sound like a secret worth knowing. So here she was. She was on her second skewer when she felt it. Not a sound, exactly. More like a disturbance, a shift in the air around her legs, followed by a very distinct and very human pressure against her calves, and then the unmistakable sensation of someone crouching directly beneath the wide linen of her midi skirt. She froze. The paper cup stayed at her lips. The skewer stayed in her hand. Every muscle in her body went completely still, in the way that happens when your brain is trying to calculate whether you are in danger or just in a situation so bizarre it hasn't developed a category for it yet. From beneath her skirt, she heard breathing, controlled but fast. She set the cup down very slowly. Set. From somewhere to her left, there was a commotion, raised voices, the sound of running feet, someone calling out in Korean, the specific chaos of a crowd that had suddenly become a crowd with a purpose. She recognized the quality of it instinctively, the way you recognize a weather pattern. Not the words, not the specifics, but the energy underneath, which was the energy of people organizing around a target. She had been in enough business negotiations to know what pursuit looked and sounded like. Someone was being looked for. The breathing under her skirt slowed deliberately. Cassidy looked around. Nobody was looking at her. The stall ajuma across from her was focused on her griddle. The family to her right was busy with their food. The people moving through the aisle were craning their necks toward whatever the commotion was, moving away from her, not toward her. She looked down at her skirt. She looked back up. She picked up her skewer and took another bite of tteokbokki, because she could not think of a single other reasonable thing to do. About 90 seconds passed. She counted. The commotion moved further down the market row, the voices fading, the energy dissipating. Slowly, like a tide going out. Then, from somewhere around her knees, a voice said, in English, low and careful and almost impressively calm given the circumstances, "Please don't scream." Cassidy finished chewing. "Give me one good reason." A pause. "I'm not dangerous." That's exactly what a dangerous person would say. Another pause, and then something that was, against all odds, a suppressed laugh. She felt it more than she heard it, a small shudder of movement against the fabric. "That's fair," the voice admitted. "Also, I wasn't. This was not planned. I want you to know that. You hid under a stranger's skirt unplanned. That's somehow worse. There were cameras. There are cameras everywhere. This is a public market. Different cameras, the kind that..." He stopped, started again. "The kind that follow me specifically." Cassidy considered this. She looked toward the direction the commotion had gone. She thought about the way the crowd had moved, the urgency in those voices, the way it had all been pointed in a direction and not at her. "Are you," she said slowly, "someone famous?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. "Get out from under my skirt." He did, carefully, with what she could only describe as practiced discretion, surfacing beside the bench like he had simply been crouching down to fix his shoe. He sat on the far end of the bench in one smooth motion, pulled a hat from somewhere, she didn't see where, and put it on. He was wearing a mask over the lower half of his face, the kind that half the city wore. His jacket had the collar turned up. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Thank you." Sincere, not performed. "Don't thank me. I didn't do anything. You hid. I sat there. You didn't scream. I was eating." He looked at the skewer in her hand. Something moved in his expression. She couldn't see his mouth, but she could see the corners of his eyes shift, and she had the distinct impression he was smiling. "American?" he asked. "Is it that obvious?" "The English. And the way you said that's somehow worse. Very American cadence." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the particular attention of someone who was used to watching people, or used to being watched, or possibly both. "And you speak good English." "I've had practice." He glanced toward the far end of the market row. Whatever he was checking for, he seemed to decide it wasn't there. His shoulders dropped a fraction. "Are you visiting?" "Working. You." He made a small gesture that managed to encompass all of Seoul in a single movement. "Living." "Right." She picked up her paper cup again. "Well, you're welcome, I guess, for the accidental sanctuary." "Accidental sanctuary." He repeated it like he was tasting the phrase. "I like that. Can I buy you another tteokbokki? As thanks?" She looked at the stall in front of them. She looked at him. She thought about the 24 days left on her calendar and the email still unread on her phone and the very clear boundary she had drawn around this trip, which was, "This is work. This is not an adventure. Do not get distracted." "No." She stood up, collected her cup and her phone, and turned to go. "I didn't get your name," he called after her. "I know," she said, without turning around. She walked out of the market and back into the October air. And she told herself the warmth she felt had everything to do with the tteokbokki and nothing to do with the man on the bench, and she almost believed it. She found him 2 days later in a cafe. Not on purpose. She wanted to make that very clear. To herself, primarily, because there was no one else to tell. She was not looking for him. She did not know his name. She had thought about the market incident exactly 3 times since it happened, which she considered a reasonable number. And each time she had concluded that it was simply a funny story she would tell someday at a dinner party, and that would be the end of it. The cafe was called Maru, and it was close enough to the Xinhua offices that it had become her morning stop. The flat white was excellent, and the corner table by the window had an outlet, which in a foreign city felt like finding water in a desert. She had claimed it every morning for 5 days. He was sitting at her table, not at a different table, at the table, in the corner, by the outlet. She stood at the counter with her coffee and looked at him, and he looked back at her from under the brim of a different hat. Still the mask, still the turned-up collar, but the eyes were the same, and they did the same thing they'd done in the market. They shifted at the corners in a way that meant he was smiling before his mouth had moved. He lifted one hand in a small wave. She walked over because the outlet was there, and she needed it, and for no other reason. And this is my table. There are no assigned tables in cafes. There's a social contract. I've been here every morning. The staff knows my order. They know my order too. She looked at the barista. The barista gave her a look that was deeply neutral and unhelpful. Cassidy sat down across from him because there was genuinely nowhere else to sit, and because the alternative was standing at the counter like she was waiting for something, which she wasn't. She opened her laptop. She plugged in her charger. She did not look at him. You didn't scream yesterday either. You weren't here yesterday. I mean just now, at the market. You didn't scream. And just now, you didn't make a scene. A lot of people would have. She glanced up from her screen. I'm not a lot of people. No, he agreed, and there was something in the way he said it that made the back of her neck feel warm. You're not. She went back to her screen. He went back to whatever was on his phone. For 3 whole minutes, they sat in a silence that was, annoyingly, not uncomfortable. The barista brought him something she hadn't seen him order, which meant he was a regular in a way that took time and consistency to build. He thanked the barista in Korean with the ease of someone who wasn't performing politeness, but simply had it. Whatever he was in the parts of Seoul that recognized him, here he was just a man in a hat who had a standing order and a preferred corner. She found that interesting. She also found it interesting that she found it interesting and returned firmly to her email. Rijun. She looked up. My name. He tilted his head. Since you didn't ask. She hadn't asked because she'd told herself she didn't want to know. Which, she realized, was different from not wanting to know. Slightly. Meaningfully. Cassidy. Cassidy. He said it carefully, testing the sounds. That's unusual. My mother liked it. It suits you. He said it like an observation, not a compliment, which was somehow more effective than if he'd said it like a compliment. She returned to her email. He returned to his phone. Around them, the cafe moved through its Tuesday morning rhythms, the milk steamer, the low conversation, the door opening and closing, letting in small drafts of October. What are you working on? He asked. A contract. Entertainment. She looked at him again. How did you guess? You're near the Xinhua building. And you have that look. What look? The one people get when they're reading something that's very expensive and also very boring. She laughed before she could stop herself. It came out faster than she intended, short and real, and she covered it quickly by taking a drink of her coffee. What do you do? She asked. She meant it as a deflection, a way to move the conversation onto terrain she could control. He paused, and in that pause was the entire weight of whatever the answer actually was. A beat of silence, the kind with weight inside it. Music. I work in music. Producer? Performer. Ah. She nodded. Is that who the cameras were following? The cameras follow the performance. Yes. She looked at him across the table, the hat, the mask, the careful anonymous construction of him. And she thought, suddenly, that there was something genuinely lonely about needing to wear your own face like a disguise. She didn't say it. It wasn't her thought to say. Are you good? She asked instead. He blinked. At music? Yes. A slow smile moved through his eyes. And I'm told I'm very good. By who? By a significant number of people. That could mean anything. Critics, fans, your mother. Definitely not my mother. She thinks I should have been a lawyer. Smart woman. He pointed at her. You're sarcastic. I've been told. I like it. Again, an observation, not a compliment. Worse, she closed her laptop because she was getting absolutely nothing done and might as well acknowledge it. How long have you been in music? Since I was 15. I'm 26 now. 11 years. She did the math automatically. 15, entering an industry that would have started shaping him immediately. What he ate, how he slept, who he was in public, who he was allowed to be. She didn't say any of that either. That's young to start. It's the only way to start, in this industry. You come in young or you don't come in. Do you like it? He was quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet from his other pauses. Less strategic, more honest. I love the music. The rest of it... He stopped. The rest of it is complicated. She nodded. She understood complicated. Complicated was, in many ways, her entire professional vocabulary. They sat for another hour. They didn't talk constantly. There were stretches of quiet that neither of them felt the need to fill. She worked. He read something on his phone. Occasionally one of them said something, and the other responded, and it went back to quiet again. It was, she thought reluctantly, one of the more comfortable hours she'd spent since landing in Seoul. When she finally packed up to leave, he looked up from his phone. Same time tomorrow, he asked. She pulled on her coat. I don't know what you're talking about. This is my table. Shared custody. He tilted his chin. Very amicable. She did not smile at that. She left before her face could argue. She Googled him that night. She lasted until approximately 10:30 before she typed his name into the search bar, and what came back was substantial. Pages of it, images of it, videos of it. Ri Jun-han, member of Lunex, one of the most followed K-pop acts in Asia and growing rapidly everywhere else, whose most recent album had debuted at #1 in 7 countries, and whose tour, a world tour, was currently on a domestic hiatus before resuming in approximately 8 weeks. There was a fan wiki. There were interview compilations. There was a thread on a forum she'd never heard of called Moments That Prove Ri-jun is Actually Hilarious, that had over 40,000 upvotes. And she made the mistake of clicking it, and 40 minutes later she was still reading it. She put her phone face down on the hotel pillow. She picked it up again. He was, she could admit this to herself, in the privacy of her own head at 11 p.m., magnetic. That was the word. Even on a screen. Even in clips of variety show appearances and concert footage and the occasional unguarded moment caught by someone's phone, there was something about him that pulled at you. He was funny. Genuinely funny. Not in the polished, packaged way of someone who'd been media-trained to seem relatable, but in the way of a person who had a natural comic rhythm and knew how to use it. He was competitive. She found 3 separate clips of him refusing to lose at things he had no business caring about, including a word game, a penalty kick contest with his bandmates, and what appeared to be an argument about whether a particular song they'd covered counted as their best cover or only second best. He had also, in a concert 2 years ago, performed a ballad that made what appeared to be an entire stadium cry simultaneously, and she watched 12 seconds of it before she closed the app because it was 11 at night and she did not need that. The question now was what to do with this information. She could tell him. Walk into the cafe tomorrow and say, I know who you are. I looked you up. I have seen the forum post about the time you cried at a dog video and tried to pretend it was allergies. This would be honest. Cassidy generally preferred honest. But she turned it over and found a different truth underneath. She liked the version of him she'd met. The man on the bench who'd said, please don't scream. The man across the cafe table who'd said, I love the music, and then stopped. That version of him was simpler, more present, not layered under everything his name carried with it. If she told him, he'd know she'd looked. And if he knew she'd looked, he'd wonder what she'd found. And then they'd both be performing for an audience of each other's expectations. She put her phone on the nightstand. She turned off the light. She would not tell him. She would let him be Rejun, who worked in music. And she would be Cassidy, who worked on contracts. And they would share a cafe table for whatever time she had left in this city. And then she would go home, and it would be a good story. And that would be the end of it. 23 days. She slept. He proposed the bet on a Thursday. They were on their 4th consecutive morning at what had, through no formal agreement, become their table. The barista had started bringing Cassidy's flat white and Rejun's Americano at the same time, which she found both presumptuous and privately gratifying. The bet came out of an argument about Seoul. She'd said something about a district she'd been trying to get to but hadn't managed yet, Ikseondong, with its renovated Hanok alleys and the particular quality of light people described. She'd said it the way you say things when you're slightly resentful of being too busy to do what you want, and he'd looked up from his phone and said, "You've been here over a week and you haven't gone?" "I've been working. It's 20 minutes away. I know where it is. Do you know what you're missing?" "I have a general idea." He leaned forward. "Here's what I think. I think you've been in this city for 9 days, and you've seen the inside of that building, this cafe, and your hotel room. I think you're using work as a reason not to explore because exploring means admitting you like it here. And I think you don't want to like it here because you're leaving." The accuracy of this landed somewhere in her chest with a small, uncomfortable thud. That's a lot of thinking for someone who just works in music. "I'm a performer. Reading people is the job." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and a little bit satisfied, which was irritating. "What's the bet?" she said. "I show you one thing in this city every evening this week. If by Sunday you can tell me, honestly, that none of it was worth seeing, I'll leave you this table for the rest of your trip without contest. And if I can't, then you owe me a real conversation. We have real conversations. We have careful ones." He tilted his head. "Not the same thing." She considered him across the table. She thought about 22 days and a contract, and the very clear plan she had. She thought about the loneliness she'd clocked in him and hadn't said anything about. She thought about the tour, still weeks away, that she'd read about on a fan wiki at 11 p.m., while telling herself she wasn't interested. One condition: you don't try to show off. What does that mean? It means you don't take me somewhere you've taken people before to impress them. You take me somewhere that actually means something to you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Deal." They shook hands across the coffee cups, and the cafe continued around them, and neither of them mentioned that what they were making was not exactly a bet. It was a week, and a week was a particular, specific thing, with a shape to it. Thursday evening, he took her to a small music venue in Mapo, the kind with no visible signage and a staircase that went down instead of up, and a stage the size of a living room. A band was playing, 3 people and a keyboard. Nothing famous, nothing polished. The music was the sort that fills your chest cavity and stays there. He stood beside her in the crowd and didn't say a word about who he was or what he did, or what any of it meant. She didn't ask. She just listened. On the walk back to the subway, she said, "Okay, that was worth seeing." He looked like he'd won something. She decided not to give him the satisfaction of knowing she'd been moved. Friday. He took her to a bookshop in Jongno that had been operating since 1980. The owner was there, old and unhurried. And Rejun spoke to him in Korean for a while, and then translated for Cassidy in pieces. Not everything, just the parts that mattered. The man had kept the shop through 3 economic crises and a flood, and had never once considered closing it. Not because the shop made him rich, but because he said books were how a city talked to itself across time, and someone had to listen. On the way out, she bought 2 books she couldn't read yet. She thought she might find a way. She also thought, on the walk back to the subway, that she hadn't once felt like a tourist that evening. She'd felt like someone visiting a place that mattered to someone she knew, which was a different thing, closer to being let in than being shown around. She didn't tell him that, but she thought he probably knew. He had that quality, the performer's instinct for what was landing, refined over 11 years into something that had stopped being professional and become personal. He noticed things. He just didn't always announce that he'd noticed. "What did you think?" he asked on the platform. "Of the bookshop. Of the owner." She considered. "I think I want to be that certain about something when I'm his age." He looked at her. "What would it be?" She shook her head. "I don't know yet." A pause. "Maybe I'm still finding out." He nodded, and the train came, and they didn't say anything else about it, but it stayed. The way certain small exchanges stay, quiet and specific, like a note you write to yourself in a margin. On Saturday, he took her to a rooftop. It wasn't 2 a.m. when they arrived. It was closer to 9 in the evening, but it became 2 a.m. That was the thing about that night. It had that quality where time decides to move differently, and you don't notice until it's gone. The rooftop was in Yongsan, above a building that had no obvious public access, but that Riju navigated with the confidence of someone who had been there before and had not been told to leave. Seoul spread out below and around them, not dramatic, not a postcard, just the city being itself, layer after layer of lit windows and moving traffic, and the slow pulse of something ongoing and enormous. He had brought coffee in travel cups. She had brought nothing, because she hadn't known. He handed her one without making it a gesture, which was the right instinct. They stood at the edge for a while, not talking. The city did the talking. Eventually she said, "When did you find this place?" "About 4 years ago. Bad night. I just walked until I stopped somewhere, and this was where I stopped." She didn't push on the bad night, but she filed it. "Do you bring people here?" "No. I come here alone, usually." Something in his voice settled when he said it. Not sad, just factual. She looked at him. He was looking at the city. "Why me, then?" He thought about it. "You asked for somewhere real." A pause. "This is real." She turned back to the view. Somewhere below, a bus went by, its lights sweeping the street. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. I might not answer. Fair." She held her coffee cup in both hands. The mask and the hat and all of it. Does it ever feel like you're hiding from something that's actually yours? Like, your own life is a place you can only go in disguise. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd gone too far. She was about to say never mind when he spoke. "Yes. More than I let myself think about." She nodded. She didn't say sorry, because it wasn't a thing to be sorry about. It was just true, and true things didn't need apologies. "The music is mine," he continued. "Even when it's packaged and scheduled and optimized, the actual music, the part underneath all of that, it's mine, but the rest of it." He stopped. Started again. "I've been in this industry since I was 15. I've been performing since before I understood what I was performing for. There are days when I can't tell the difference between who I am and who I've been trained to be." He paused, and that's the most honest I've been about that. "With anyone?" "With anyone." She looked at him, and she thought about the forum post and the dog video and the ballad in front of the stadium and the boy who'd entered an industry at 15 and come out 26 and exhausted in ways he was only now starting to name. "I think the fact that you can tell the difference is important," she said carefully. "Even if the line is blurry, you know there's a line. A lot of people stop knowing." He turned to look at her. Something in his face had opened up in a way it hadn't before, like a door that someone had been holding almost closed, and had decided, briefly, to let swing. "You're not what I expected." "You expected something?" "Not specifically, but..." He shook his head slightly. "Not this." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the city, because the moment felt like something that needed a little room. "What about you? What are you not saying?" She laughed, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You said I'd been honest. The deal was a real conversation. That goes both ways." She considered this. She could deflect. She was very good at deflecting. But there was something about the rooftop, and the coffee, and the way he'd said this is real, that made deflection feel small. "I'm good at my job," she said slowly. "And I've spent the last 3 years making sure that's the most interesting thing about me. Because it's safe. If the most interesting thing is professional, then nothing personal can..." She stopped. "Can what?" "Disappoint anyone?" She said it to the city. "Or get left behind." He was quiet. "And that's the most honest I've been about that." The corner of his eye shifted. He was smiling under the mask. "Now, we're even." They stayed until the coffee was cold, and the sky had gone from dark blue to black. And then Rejun looked at his phone and said with some alarm that it was nearly 2 a.m, and Cassidy looked at her phone and said she had a 7:30 meeting. And they both started laughing at the same time. The helpless kind, at the absurdity of themselves. And the laugh settled into the kind of quiet that only comes after. On the train back, they sat beside each other and she fell half asleep against the window and he didn't say anything about it. When she got off at her stop, she turned and said, "You win the bet." He said, "I know." The week became 10 days and then 2 weeks, and they stopped counting in the way that people stop counting when they're trying not to know the number. They had developed a rhythm that neither of them had designed. Mornings at the cafe. Her meetings during the day. His schedule, whatever it was. She didn't ask for specifics and he didn't offer them, but she knew from the industry noise she was around that Lunex was in some kind of intensive pre-tour production phase, which meant his days were full in ways hers were, just differently. Some evenings they explored, some evenings they didn't. And a few evenings she went back to her hotel and worked, and he texted her something ridiculous about a competition he'd had with someone. Once it was a staring contest with a junior member of his group that had apparently lasted 22 minutes and ended in what he described as a controversial draw. Once it was a debate about the correct way to eat a particular dish, a debate he outlined in 3 detailed paragraphs that she read at her desk while on hold with a lawyer in New York and had to compose herself before getting back on the call. Once he sent her a voice memo of himself narrating, in deadpan, the experience of trying to teach someone else to cook and watching them make a sequence of decisions that he considered philosophically offensive. She responded with the kind of energy she usually reserved for people she'd known for years. She didn't examine that too closely. She was a consultant. She knew when something was working and she left working things alone. What she couldn't leave alone, what she kept returning to in the quiet of her hotel room after the calls were done and the emails answered, was the question of what this was, not what it felt like. She knew what it felt like. She had known it for weeks now, building slowly the way the most certain things always do. What she couldn't categorize was what it meant for a person who had built her life on clean categories, legible plans, and the professional discipline of not wanting things she couldn't have on her timeline. She wanted this. That was the problem. Not in the panicked, chaotic way of something out of control, but in the quieter, more dangerous way of something that had simply become necessary without asking permission. That was the thing she kept brushing up against and refusing to name. The ease of it. The way she'd stopped monitoring herself around him. The way he made her laugh before she could decide whether to. With 7 days left, she told him about the contract, not the details, just the shape of it. A deal between American and Korean entertainment infrastructure that, if she closed it well, would change the arc of her career, in the way that very few moments actually do. She told him she had built toward this kind of opportunity for 3 years, that she had taken the soul assignment specifically, had asked for it, had prepared for it. So you knew what this trip was for. I always know what a trip is for. They were walking along the Cheonggycheon stream, lanterns overhead, the sound of water underneath the city sounds. And now? He asked. She looked at the water. Now I know what the trip was for, and also what it became. They're not the same thing. He didn't say anything. She appreciated that he didn't fill it with something reassuring. I'm good at compartmentalizing. It's a professional skill. You separate the things that need separating so they don't... She stopped. So they don't what? So they don't complicate each other. He was quiet for a moment. And are they separated? She didn't answer. He didn't push. They walked the rest of the stream in a silence that had weight to it. Not uncomfortable, but dense. The kind of silence that happens when two people are both aware of the same thing and are choosing, by mutual unspoken agreement, not to make it real yet. With 5 days left, she nearly lost the contract. The Xinhua negotiation hit a wall, a structural disagreement about creative control clauses that her client in New York was being inflexible about, and which the Korean side was not going to move on without a significant concession. She spent 2 full days in back-to-back calls and meetings, skipped the cafe entirely, sent Ri-jun a message that just said, "Work emergency. I'll explain when I'm out of it," and he responded an hour later with a voice memo that was him narrating, in the style of a nature documentary. A competition between himself and what she gathered was a junior member of his group, over who could balance the most objects on their head, which had absolutely nothing to do with contract law, and made her laugh so hard she had to mute herself on a call. She closed the deal on the following morning. Not perfectly. She gave ground on the creative control clause in exchange for better royalty structuring, which her client back in New York called a fair trade, and which Cassidy privately thought was the right call, even if it cost her a negotiating point she'd wanted. The best deals, she'd learned, were the ones where both sides felt they'd gotten something real. This felt like that. She sat in the Xinhua conference room after everyone had left and felt the particular quiet of something finished. It was a good quiet, the kind that came after effort, not after avoidance. She'd built toward this kind of moment for 3 years, a deal of this size, in a market this significant, closed cleanly and with her name on it. And it was real, and it mattered, and she held it for a moment before she packed up her things. She texted Ri-jun, closed it. He responded 30 seconds later with a voice memo. It was 12 seconds of him making a sound that she could only describe as genuinely unhinged celebration. Not a word, just an escalating sound of enthusiasm that collapsed into laughing. And it was so unexpected and so completely characteristic that she sat alone in the empty conference room of a major Korean entertainment company and laughed until her eyes watered. She composed herself. She picked up her bag. She walked out into Seoul with 24 hours left on her contract and a flight already booked, and the distinct, inconvenient awareness that she was not ready. With 3 days left, he looked at her across the cafe table and said, without any preamble, "I don't want you to go." She kept her eyes on her screen for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. "Ri-jun, I'm not saying don't go. I know you have to go. I'm just..." He stopped. I wanted to say it out loud, because I've been not saying it for a while and it's taking up space. She looked at him. His hat, his mask, his eyes. She knew his face now. The parts of it she was allowed. The crinkle at the corner when he was genuinely amused versus performing amusement. The way his jaw set when he was about to say something he'd thought through carefully. The stillness that came over him when music played that he actually felt. "I don't want to go either. That's true. But there's no but. It's just also true that I'm going." He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup, 3 more days. 3 more days, she agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment. Just a moment, a small amount of contact, honest and brief. And then she pulled it back. Let's make them count. They did. The airport was Incheon, Terminal 1, early morning. She'd taken a taxi at 4 a.m., which was early enough that Seoul was still doing that thing it did just before dawn, where the lights were still on, but the people were gone, and the city looked like a stage set between performances. She had told Ri-jun she would say goodbye the night before. They'd had dinner, not at a fancy restaurant, just the tteokbokki place in Gwangjang, back where it started, which she'd chosen deliberately and which he'd recognized the symbolism of without her explaining it. They'd talked about everything except what they were really talking about. He'd said, at one point, "You know I have a tour in 5 weeks." "I know. It goes through North America. Eventually." "How eventually?" He looked at the table. February." February was 4 months away. She had done the math before he said it. She suspected he had done it too. That's a long time. "It's not forever." She looked at him. "I know." At the end of dinner, he'd walked her back to the taxi, and when she'd turned to say goodbye, he'd pulled her into a hug that was quiet and certain, not desperate, not performative, just real in the way that some physical things are real in a way words can't quite replicate. She'd stood in it for a second longer than she needed to. "Thank you for the rooftop." "Thank you for the skirt," he said, against the top of her head. She laughed. It came out crooked, somewhere between laughing and not. She got in the taxi. Now, at gate B12, she was sitting with a coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at a departures board, thinking about 4 months and the word eventually in the way he'd said, "I don't want you to go with the particular care of someone who understood that honesty was worth the cost of vulnerability." She was thinking about compartments, about how she'd spent 3 years building very clean ones, about how this month had been a very persistent argument against the system. She thought about what she would tell herself when the plane was in the air and Seoul was getting smaller. She thought about what she would tell herself when she was back in her apartment in New York, in her routine, in the specific shape of the life she'd constructed. She thought she would probably tell herself it was beautiful and real, and now over, and that was okay, and that some things didn't need to become something else to have mattered. She thought she probably wouldn't believe it. The boarding announcement came. She gathered her bag. She got in line. She didn't look back at the city through the windows. She'd already said goodbye to the rooftop, to the cafe, to the stream with the lanterns, to the bookshop owner who talked about books as a city's conversation with itself across time. She'd said all of it internally, quietly, on the taxi ride, while Seoul passed by outside. What she hadn't said goodbye to, what she was not ready to name as a goodbye, was the version of herself that had existed in this city. The one who had sat on a bench eating tteokbokki and not screamed. The one who had let a bet become a week and a week become something with weight. The one who had stood on a rooftop at 2 a.m. and said the truest thing she knew about herself to a person she'd met 11 days before and felt, not afraid, but relieved. Like putting something down you'd been carrying without noticing. That version of her was not something she was leaving behind. She understood that now, in the departure gate at Incheon, watching planes move on the tarmac with the slow, deliberate certainty of things that know exactly where they're going. She was taking that version home. It was going to require some rearranging when she got there. She was okay with rearranging. She boarded the plane. She found her seat. She put her bag in the overhead compartment. She sat down by the window, which she always chose because there was something about having a wall on one side that felt better, even if the wall was just the thin shell of a plane between her and 35,000 feet of open air. The man in the aisle seat was already asleep. The seat between them stayed empty, which was the kind of small luck that felt, this morning, like the universe offering a slightly generous gesture. She put on her headphones. She chose a playlist at random. The first song that played was not Ri-jun's, but it was the kind of music that his music was: Korean, layered, meant to be felt rather than just heard. She listened to it all the way through. The story got out 3 days after she landed. She was back in New York, back in the office on the 22nd floor with the view of Midtown and the coffee that was objectively worse than Maru, in a debrief meeting about the Xinhua deal. She was presenting the final contract summary when her phone, face down on the table, buzzed 4 times in quick succession. She ignored it. It buzzed 6 more times. After the meeting, she picked it up and found 15 messages from a group chat with colleagues, all linking to the same story. K-pop group Lunex's Ri Jun-han had canceled all scheduled activities, including multiple pre-tour promotional appearances, without explanation. His agency had issued a brief statement citing personal reasons. Lunex's label stock had dropped 2 points. Social media was in significant distress. She sat down in her office chair. She read the article 3 times. There was a photo, not of him, just of the empty stage at a promotional event, chairs and microphones set up for an interview that hadn't happened. The caption said the other members of Lunex had appeared without him and declined to comment beyond the official statement. She called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Are you okay?" she said immediately. "Yes." A pause, like he was testing the accuracy of the word. Yes. "Are you back? 3 days ago? What happened? The articles are saying..." "I know what the articles are saying." A pause. "I needed to stop. I'd been going for 11 years without stopping, and I needed to stop. And I stopped." She processed this. "Okay. Are you in trouble? With your label?" "Probably." He didn't sound afraid of it. He sounded like someone who had made a calculation and decided the cost was acceptable. "It's being managed. Rijun. Cassidy." His voice was very quiet. "I'm fine. I promise. I needed to hear what it sounded like. On this end, when the schedule wasn't running." She thought she understood what he was saying. And it's very quiet. She let that sit for a moment. Is quiet good? I don't know yet. A pause. I think so. They talked for an hour that night. Not about the situation. Mostly. About New York versus Seoul in late October, which she said was a different kind of cold, and he said was probably worse because American cities didn't know how to be cold with dignity. About the Xinhua deal, which she told him she'd closed, and which he responded to with genuine enthusiasm that she found both touching and slightly excessive. About the bookshop in Yongyo, which she'd started looking up remotely, considering whether any of its translated titles were available internationally. Before she got off the phone, he said, "I'll talk to my team about what's possible with the tour schedule. You don't have to restructure a world tour in addition to..." He paused. "It's February. In North America. You mentioned... I wanted to make sure you remembered." She smiled at her window, at the Midtown lights. "I remembered." A pause, and then the steadiness she'd come to recognize. "Good. Then I'll talk to my team." She didn't know he was coming. That was the part she kept coming back to afterward. Not that he came, but that he came without telling her. That he'd decided, and gotten on a plane, and landed, and only texted her when he was already in the city. The text was 3 words. "I'm in New York." She was in her apartment on a Sunday afternoon with work spread across her kitchen table and laundry she'd been meaning to do for 4 days, and no particular plan for the evening. She read the text twice. Then she texted back, "Why didn't you tell me?" He responded immediately, "Because you would have told me it wasn't necessary, and I would have agreed with you, and then I wouldn't have come." She stood in her kitchen for a full 30 seconds just holding her phone. Then she texted her address. He showed up 40 minutes later with no luggage except a backpack, still wearing a mask, which she thought was both completely unnecessary in Manhattan and completely him. She opened the door and he looked at her with that expression she'd learned to read. Eyes shifted at the corners, present and unguarded. And she said, "You're ridiculous. Good to see you too. Did your label know you were leaving the country?" They were informed. That's not the same as them approving. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let him in. He looked around her apartment the way he'd looked at Seoul's skyline from the rooftop, attentive, genuinely interested, no performance in it. "It's small. It's New York. You have a lot of books. I have a hobby." He picked one up from the stack on her coffee table, looked at the spine, put it back. He turned around and looked at her. "I have 12 days, before I need to be back for pre-tour resumption. The label is cooperating, with conditions, 12 days, and then the tour, which has 2 North American legs. The second one ends in New York." She did the math. End of February, probably. 4 months from when she'd left Seoul. She had told herself 4 months was a long time. Standing here, with him in her apartment, she was doing a different calculation, one that accounted for 12 days now, and a city in February, and the particular information of someone getting on a plane without announcing it, because he knew she'd talk him out of it. "You came without telling me," she said, "because you were afraid I'd be sensible." "Yes. That's..." She stopped. "That's actually exactly what I would have done." "I know you." He said it simply. 3 weeks and I know the way you think." She looked at him. He looked back. "We're going to have a real problem," she said, "when the February leg ends and you have to go back." "Yes," he agreed. "We should think about that." "We should." He paused. "We don't have to do it today." She almost smiled. "No, not today." She put her coat on because he hadn't eaten anything since the plane, and New York had food worth defending and she was going to defend it. And he complained the whole way down the stairs that he'd just traveled 12 hours, and she could at least let him sit down first. And she said he could sit down at the restaurant, and he said that was very cold. And she said he had 12 days to decide if he could live with it. On the sidewalk, he fell into step beside her, and the city moved around them, taxis and noise and October in New York. Different from October in Seoul, but the same month, the same season. And she thought that this was the thing about people who fit each other in some fundamental way. They fit in different cities too. The context changed. The thing itself didn't. She didn't say that out loud. But she thought it, and it stayed. The 12 days were, as all borrowed time is, both shorter and longer than they should have been. They argued about everything, which she had expected, and which was one of her favorite things about him, even when she would not admit it. They argued about who made better coffee. She said New York had the variety. He said Seoul had the quality, and they were both right and both wrong. They argued about which of her jacket choices was appropriate for the weather on a given day, which she found presumptuous, and he found obvious. And they were arguing about this on the 3rd day when it started raining, and she was vindicated, and he claimed he had said to bring both jackets. They went to a jazz club in the West Village on the 4th night, and he listened the way he'd listened to the band in Mapo, the focused, full-body kind of listening that musicians do when they hear something worth hearing. On the walk back, she asked him what he thought, and he talked about music for 45 minutes in a way that was the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. And she didn't say a single word the whole time, just walked beside him and let him talk. On the 7th day, he told her something she hadn't known. The 7 days before, that had been their soul rhythm transposed onto a different city, and the transplant had taken better than she expected. They walked. They argued. They found a jazz club, and a good noodle place, and a bookshop in Brooklyn that he spent 40 minutes in, while she waited outside, and then went back in, because the waiting was more disruptive than the browsing. New York did not throw him, or if it did, he didn't show it. He moved through the city with the ease of someone who had learned, by necessity, to be comfortable in unfamiliar places. She thought about 15-year-old Ri Jun entering an industry that had immediately started telling him who to be, and the elasticity required to survive that, and how that elasticity probably looked like adaptability from the outside and probably felt like something lonelier from the inside. She didn't say any of that, but she thought it. And she thought it with the specific tenderness of knowing someone well enough to see past what they showed. They were in her apartment, Sunday morning, coffee, work on her end, something on his phone on his end. Their exact rhythm, except in her kitchen instead of Maru. And he said, without looking up, "When I left Seoul after you did, I went to the rooftop." She looked at him. "Just to..." He paused. "I don't know." To check if it was still real. Sometimes places feel different when the person you were there with is gone. Was it? It was different, but it was still real. He looked up. That was when I decided. She understood what he was saying. About coming here. Yes. She looked at her coffee cup. That's... She stopped. Started again. "I want you to know that wasn't sensible of you." "I know. It was also..." She stopped again. Cassidy Moore, who had words for everything, who could negotiate a contract and restructure a clause and find the language for any professional position, sat in her own kitchen and found that the language for this particular thing was further down than she usually went. His voice came quiet across the kitchen. "You don't have to say it. I want to say it." She looked at him. "It was the best unsensible thing that's happened to me in years. The whole thing. The skirt, the cafe, the rooftop. You." She took a breath. "You." He looked at her with that expression she'd learned, and then memorized and then carried with her on a 12-hour flight back to her life. The one where his eyes went quiet and warm at the same time. "When Cassidy Moore came to Seoul for 30 days, he said, and his voice had that narrating quality, not mocking, something gentler than that, and did not plan to be changed by it. And yet, it was on the 9th day that it came out. They were in the kind of argument that had become their natural habitat, this time about whether a particular New York pizza place deserved its reputation, which Rejun had decided, after one slice, that it did not, and which Cassidy was defending on pure territorial principle, when he said something about a show he'd done in Chicago, and she, without thinking, said, "Right, the one where the keyboard rig broke in the second set." The silence that followed was very specific. He looked at her. She looked at him. And she watched, in real time, as he did the calculation. "Cassidy. I can explain. How long?" She pressed her lips together. "The night after the cafe. Day 2. He stared at her. "You Googled me. I Googled you. And you knew. This whole time in Seoul, you knew who I was. I knew who you were professionally. I didn't know..." She stopped. "I didn't know you. Those are different." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it, turning it over, and she genuinely could not tell which direction it was going to land. Then, the dog video. She closed her eyes. Yes. The forum post. There were 40,000 upvotes. It was very findable. The penalty kick contest. You were extremely invested in that penalty kick contest. He pointed at her. I was robbed. You absolutely were not robbed. You just... She stopped, looked at him. Are you actually upset? He thought about it, genuinely considered it, and she could see the moment it resolved, the corner of his eye, that particular shift. You watched the dog video. He looked at her. And you still let me pretend to be a stranger. You seemed to need it. I did need it. A pause. That was another pause. And that was actually thoughtful of you. Don't make it weird. You watched 40 minutes of a fan forum about me. I said don't make it weird. And then came back to the cafe the next morning and pretended you'd never heard of me. I was being considerate. He looked at her for a long moment. Something warm and unbearably amused moved through his expression. The penalty kick thing. He leaned back. And what did you actually think? She bit the inside of her cheek. I think you were robbed. He pointed at her again. That's why I told you the stupid things. She laughed, the helpless kind, the kind that came up before she could manage it. And he laughed too. And the argument about the pizza dissolved entirely, which was probably for the best because she'd been losing it anyway. Later, when the laughing had settled, he looked at her across the kitchen and said, simply, "Thank you for pretending." She met his eyes. "Thank you for needing somewhere to be yourself." They left it there. It didn't need more. On the last morning, she made coffee while he packed his backpack. And neither of them said much because they were both, she thought, feeling the particular weight of 12 more days joining the 30 in soul and becoming something with shape and mass. She thought about the word eventually. She thought about February. She thought about what her therapist back in New York would say about a person who had built very careful compartments, spending 2 months letting someone take them apart and deciding she was fine with it. She thought she probably was fine with it, which was itself a small, significant change. At the door, he turned. February. February, she agreed. I'll call you from every city on the tour. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at her steadily. I want to. I want to call you from Tokyo and from London and from Sao Paulo and tell you stupid things that don't matter because it'll mean. He stopped. Because it'll mean what? She said softly. Because it'll mean you're someone I'm telling stupid things to. He said it with the directness he'd used on the rooftop, the kind that came from somewhere underneath performance. That's not nothing. For me, that's not nothing. She stepped forward and hugged him, and he held on. And outside, New York was doing its ongoing New York business. Taxis and voices, and the unremarkable ongoing miracle of millions of people occupying the same small island. And she thought, 4 months, 2 continents, 1 promise that doesn't have a form yet but exists anyway, in the way that real things exist before they're named. Tell me the stupid things. Always. No hesitation. He left. She stood at the door for a moment after he was gone, listening to the sound of the building, the elevator, a neighbor's television, the city underneath everything, and felt the particular quality of an absence that is not the same as loss. He wasn't gone, he was in transit. There was a difference, and she held it carefully. She went back to her coffee. She opened her laptop. Outside, November was beginning its slow establishment over New York, and somewhere over the Atlantic, a plane was carrying someone who had hidden under her skirt in a soul market because he had nowhere else to go, and had somehow, in 30 days, and then 12, become the person she told things to that she hadn't known she needed to say. She opened a new document. At the top, she typed, "Things to do before February." She looked at it for a moment. Then, underneath, she typed, "Learn to read Korean." She smiled at the screen. It was small and private and completely real. She got to work. Some love stories start with grand gestures and sweep. This one started with a stranger under a skirt in a market that smelled like sesame and frying batter. And maybe that's the truest kind. The kind that catches you eating, mouthful, completely unprepared, and changes the geography of yourself before you've had a chance to object. Cassidy Moore went to Seoul to close a deal. She did. She also, unplanned, inconvenient, and entirely worth it, started something she has absolutely no intention of closing. February is coming. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And drop a comment. What was your favorite moment? Mine might be the skirt, but the rooftop is a very close second.